In the blistering heat of a frontier auction yard, a down-on-his-luck rancher named Albert Thorne was about to make a choice that would turn ridicule into revelation. What started as a routine livestock sale beneath a cloudless sky took a shocking turn when he came face to face with a limping bay stallion that everyone else had given up on. Albert Thorne wasn't your typical horse trader. For 15 hard years, he had bartered and lost everything worth keeping: his land, his family, and his faith in his own judgment. Known across the county for his quiet stubbornness and uncanny eye for hidden strength, Albert had learned to see what others missed. When he encountered the injured horse dragging its hind leg through the dust, he had no idea he was about to uncover both a forgotten champion and his own redemption. Albert lifted the animal's hoof, discovering not a deformity, but a cruel mistake. A shoe so wrong it had crippled potential into pain, and that small act of mercy would lead to a journey that tested his will, his wallet, and his soul. What began as a moment of pity at a dusty auction would become a race against pride, greed, and the limits of faith. The frontier town that once mocked him would never be the same after Albert Thorne and his worthless horse outran not only their pasts, but every living thing with breath and hooves. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The horse limped toward the auction block, dragging its left hind leg like a length of chain. Dust rose and hung in the noon heat, turning the air the color of old straw. Men shaded their eyes with poker-flat hands. A boy laughed once too loudly, and his father cuffed the sound short, because failure wasn't funny up close, and this animal was failure on 4 legs. Everyone could see the obvious defect, everyone except Albert Thorne. He leaned forward in his wooden chair until the slat bit his ribs, narrowing his gaze to the shoulder, the croup, the line from pole to withers. The animal's coat was dull from neglect, but the bone, Lord, the bone, carried the memory of better days. The stallion stood square on 3, tail clamped, sweat stippling the flank. The wrong leg kept the wrong distance from the earth, and the wrong shoe flashed crooked in the light. $5, the auctioneer called, voice already apologizing. 5 to start. You won't see another with this presence. Silence. A few hats tipped back. A fly circled a cracked lip and landed, bold. 4. The auctioneer shifted, fingers fretting his gavel. 3, 2, $, a voice said. It was not loud. It didn't need to be. The sound cut through the courtyard like a crease through paper. Heads turned. David Whitmore, all polished boots and unearned certainty, barked a laugh and shook his head. Albert, you finally lost your mind, he announced, loud enough to carry to the tavern door. That animal ain't worth the rope to hang it with. From the shadow of that doorway, Martha Holloway lifted a brow, but said nothing. She understood men who gambled and men who bled, and she had known Albert long enough to tell the difference by the set of his jaw. Today he was bleeding quietly and on purpose. Levi Caldwell stepped out from behind the block, relief flooding his face like water over dry stone. He had the haunted look of a rancher counting bales and breaths with the same arithmetic. "You sure about this, Albert?" he asked. "Doc said that leg. Well, he ain't sure it'll ever come right." Albert didn't answer. He walked toward the stallion, slow as mercy, one hand open, palm low, voice level as a heartbeat. The animal flinched, then held. Up close, the wrongness sharpened. The hoof was shod to fight its own shape, the nail set biting, the angle of the shoe driving pain up the chain with every step. But the shoulder, good God, the shoulder was a gift, long and clean, and the eye held an old intelligence under the skittish glaze of fear. Albert's fingers moved like he was reading a book he'd loved in better years, down the neck, along the spine, to the tight muscle roped over the haunch. He crouched and took the hoof, gentle as taking a child by the hand. Wrong size, wrong rake, wrong crown. He set it down slow. $1 then, the auctioneer said, hope returning to his voice like blood to a numbed hand. Sold. Snickers rippled through the courtyard, small men amusing themselves with smaller jokes. Albert did not turn to them. He laid his dollar on Levi's palm and felt the paper leave with a tug that was more relief than greed. "Name?" Martha asked when he led the horse past her threshold and into the strip of yard behind the tavern. It wasn't small talk, it was ceremony. Martha believed in names. The stallion flicked an ear, as if catching the word before it had been said. Ranger, Albert decided, hearing the shape of speed in it. The horse blew, a shallow sound that tasted of old hay and older miles. Martha nodded. "He'll eat before he thanks you," she said, and added lower, "We'll put the feed on my ledger for a week, 2 if you look me in the eye when it runs out." Albert gave her the kind of grateful look that passed for prayer in his life. He tied Ranger to a fence post polished by 100 hands and a dozen stories, then fetched a bucket and the last of his good alfalfa from a sack patched with baling twine. Ranger tested the rope, then the bucket, then the man. He chose the feed first, because hunger speaks the language every creature understands. David sauntered to the fence, hooked his thumbs in his belt. "You'll be pouring grain down a hole," he said, tone all pity and teeth. "I'd buy you a drink to drown your regret, but it'd be charity, and your pride's the only thing you haven't mortgaged." Albert didn't look up. "My pride's paid in work," he said, and the words fell like a small stone into deep water and sank out of sight. When the sun slid and the flies rose in a dark net, Ranger paced the pen's edge, stepping off. The bad leg, like he didn't know the ground would still be there when he wanted it back. Albert watched until the watching told him everything it could. He rolled his shoulders once, feeling the weight of a decision settle in the place old hurt sleep. "Tomorrow," he told the horse, "the dust, the twilight. We start where the trouble starts." Night gathered its skirts. Somewhere inside it a man laughed, and a woman told him to hush, and the piano in Martha's common room found a tune that knew the edges between sorrow and comfort. Ranger stopped pacing long enough to turn one good eye to Albert and hold it there until something like understanding passed between them. It felt like the first nail set true after a dozen that sheared and bent. Albert slept on a pallet by the pen, hat over his face, hand near the rope. Twice he woke to the sound of restless shifting and murmured a nonsense reassurance that calmed them both. Dawn arrived the way it always does, as if it had never once been in doubt. Before the town shook the sleep from its bones, a lantern bobbed through the grey like a tame star. The travelling farrier, broad hands, quiet eyes, beard salted with dust and years, set his kit down with the soft clink of tools that knew their work. "Wrong shoe," he said, "not yet at the fence, because a certain kind of man could read a gate in low light at 40 paces and be right. Maybe wrong foot too, depending on who swung the hammer." Albert's mouth tugged. "That's what I'm hoping," he said. They didn't hurry. Good hands seldom do. The farrier walked Ranger's circle twice, boots whispering in the dirt. He crouched at the hind, then the fore, then came back to the hind because patterns are more honest than first impressions. The lantern's glow turned Ranger's cannon bone to honeyed wood. The farrier touched the hoof, felt heat where it shouldn't be, traced the line where shoe met horn, too tight at the quarters, too long at the toe. Cocked a sliver off the angle God intended. "Whoever did this," he murmured. "Ask the foot to be a different foot. Can you ask it to be itself again?" Albert said. "We can ask," the farrier said. And the way he said we made Albert's throat tighten. They tied Ranger short but kind. Nose to fence rail, a loop that would hold if fear rose and not punish him for feeling it. The farrier pried nails with a prayer's patience. Each rasp of metal on metal sounded like an apology. The shoe loosed. The hoof exhaled. Ranger trembled, then stilled, and in that quiver was a history of all the wrong things done to make a right that never came. Trim, balance, rasp. The farrier worked in the language of angles and restraint, wood shavings, whispers of horn, falling to earth in crescent moons. He cut to level, not to pride. When he held the foot up to the lantern, the line from pastern to hoof cut clean through the glow. "Let's see him stand honest," he said. Ranger set the hoof down as if it might explode. It didn't. He blinked, thinking. The farrier nodded once and set to shaping a new shoe, heating iron in a portable forge until it sang red, then tapping it into a circle that fit this foot and no other. He cooled it with a hiss and a scent like rain on rail ties, then nailed it careful so no living thing in there would have reason to curse him later. "Walk him," the farrier said. Albert took the rope and moved. Ranger stepped short, then even, then short again. Then, on the fourth pass, he forgot to guard himself for the space of 3 strides, and all that bone and balance lined up like the truth, Martha. Coffee steaming in one hand, ledger in the other. Watch from the fence with a squint that could have been skepticism or mercy. "How much?" she asked the farrier, already fishing in her apron. He tipped his head toward Albert. "He pays me when the second shoe holds," he said, "and not before. You keep that ledger for feed. He'll need protein and patience." Albert ran a hand along Ranger's neck, palm flat. The horse tolerated it, then leaned into it because sometimes you bind yourself to the thing that stops the worst ache. "We'll do soft ground for a week," Albert said half to himself. "Deep bedding. Creek work if we can find him the nerve. Ground poles cut low to wake the good pathways. You speak like a man who's failed enough to read success when it shows," the farrier observed, not unkindly. Albert almost smiled. "Once or twice," he said. They led Ranger to the patch of sandy loam Martha claimed as a yard when the rain held, and a floodplain when the river remembered itself. Albert walked slow circles, counting breaths, listening for the footfalls to court each other instead of bicker. He kept Ranger's head down with a gentle line, let the back lift, the haunch engage, the barrel move like a bellows learning a better song. Notes went on a scrap of paper. Limp decreases after 3 laps. Right hip tight. Shoulder good, better than good. Eye clearing. Between the lines, in the white space, something else wrote itself. We might make it if we are stubborn and quiet and tireless. David's boots scuffed the edge of the yard before his voice announced him. "So that's the miracle, a new shoe." He laughed in a way that made the sound smaller, not bigger. Man pays $1 for a problem, then pays 200 to pretend it's a solution. Albert kept Ranger walking. "You're out early," he said. "Business waits for daylight," David replied, "but mockery wakes up when it smells a fool." Martha sipped her coffee. "Some of us wake when we smell work," she said. "It's a different perfume." The farrier shouldered his kit. "I'll be through next week," he told Albert. "If the foot holds, we set the mate and bring him level 4 to aft. Keep him off the rocks. No heroics? Heroics are what you tell yourself when you don't want to do the slow thing," Martha murmured. Ranger blew, a longer sound now. When the farrier's lantern bobbed away and the morning opened its fist to reveal the day inside, the stallion licked his lips and lowered his head to stretch. The motion was ungainly and perfect. Albert's shoulders loosened a notch. "We'll build you back," he told the horse, the words plain as a fence post. "Not to what they remember, but to what you are." He rigged ground poles from 2 lengths of split pine, set so low they were almost an idea. Ranger tripped the first time, stumbled the second, found them the third. And by the 10th pass, he floated, each footfall a quiet decision to trust the earth. They cooled out at the creek that cut a line beyond the tavern, water chuckling over glacial stones that had heard every confession this county could devise. Ranger balked at the first step, then the second, then lowered his nose to the water as if asking permission. The stream gave it. He waded in. The cold wrapped his legs like a clean bandage. "Easy," Albert said. "Easy." The sun climbed and the town began again. Wheels, voices, the piano, fumbling toward a noon tune. Levi appeared at the fence, hat in hand, eyes unsure. "I didn't know he was stolen," he said without preamble. "I didn't buy him to punish you," Albert replied, and neither man spoke of the farrier's bill waiting at the end of the week, like a long shadow. By afternoon, Ranger stood hip-shot in the shade, one hind resting, the other set honest. The limp hadn't vanished. It had retreated, petty and resentful, to a corner of the body that would no longer house it for free. Albert scrubbed sweat from his own collar with the back of his wrist and looked at his notes. 6 weeks, he wrote, diet, poles, creek, hills when he's sure. And steady even when heart isn't. He tucked the paper into his pocket and felt it there like a vow. At sundown, when the light turned the yard to copper and the flies thinned to a tolerable halo, a figure in a travel-stained dress stepped to the gate and stopped as if she'd walked into a memory. Her hand rose to her mouth. Ranger's head lifted, ears cut like knives toward the sound of a voice not yet spoken. Albert turned. Dust and distance blurred the woman's features, but not her gaze. It went past him and pinned the horse in a place beyond time. "Good evening," Martha called mildly from the door. "You look like someone who knows a name." The woman swallowed. "I do," she said, and the word landed like a stone dropped in still water, rings widening. "I do." Dawn stitched the horizon to the hills with a thin red thread, and Albert was already at the pen, steam lifting from the coffee tin and from Ranger's back in equal measure. The air smelled of wet leather and alfalfa, the sort of morning that made a man remember he still had hands worth using. They started small and stayed honest. Circles first, slow as thought, wide as patience. Albert kept the line light, his voice a low metronome. Walk and breathe, walk and breathe. Ranger's ears flicked like little weather vanes, catching direction from tone more than tug. The stallion stepped under himself and argued less with the ground. He laid out 2 split pine poles so low they seemed more suggestion than obstacle. The first pass, Ranger clipped the right with the toe and huffed like he'd been insulted. The second, he lifted too high and stuttered. The third time, he found the line, hock and hip moving like parts of an idea finally remembering each other. Albert watched the back round and lift, counted strides under his breath as if naming them made them belong. By mid-morning, he switched to figure 8s. Sweat gathered along Ranger's neck in a clean lather, drawing chalk-white lines down a bay canvas that had been dull as old brass 2 days ago. Albert's palm slid the length of the top line, searching for knots and finding fewer. He worked the tight fascia at the haunch with thumbs that had folded bread and fixed gates and buried kin. Ranger's skin twitched under the pressure, then released, the eye softening from coin-bright to warm riverstone. "You're asking muscles to remember what mercy feels like," Martha said from the fence, ledger tucked against her hip, watching with the sort of interest that money alone couldn't buy. She had brought a sack of oats and a slice of pragmatism. "You realize you're courting heartbreak as hard as triumph." "Same court, different judge," Albert said without looking up. He adjusted the caveson a notch, hummed what passed for a tune when a man had more chores than songs. David Whitmore drifted in with the dust, his boots expensive enough to advertise it. He leaned on the rail and smirked as if somebody had paid him for the expression. "Charity cases make for good stories in the tavern," he drawled. "They don't pay the feed bill. You're starving yourself to keep a useless mouth chewing." Albert didn't stop the circle. "Some of us got use beyond our mouth," he answered even, and Ranger flicked an ear toward the fence like he agreed with the sentiment. David clicked his tongue. "Every fool I ever met had a reason that warmed him while it emptied his pockets." He tipped 2 fingers to Martha in a mock salute and sauntered off. Spurs tight and conversation looser than his conscience, Levi Caldwell came by near noon. Hat in his hands, like he'd borrowed it and wasn't sure he had the right to keep it. He stood outside the fence, guilt and hope warring behind his eyes. "He looks better," he said, the words careful. "That foot holding?" "Holding," Albert said. "We'll set the mate when the farrier passes back through and bring him level." Levi nodded, without lifting his eyes. "I didn't know," he added, voice low as a confession to a priest. "About the stealing. Storm night had my herd scattered like cards. A man showed with a horse and a price I could touch. I never asked the right questions. Asking's a skill like any other," Martha said. "You pay to learn it, or you pay because you didn't." That evening, the creek wore a ribbon of light where it silvered around flat stones. Albert led Ranger into the shallows. The stallion balked at the cold shock, blew, and then stepped, muscles coiling and easing against the water's mild insistence. Each step was a small argument the stream won kindly. The cold drew heat from the swollen places and carried it away without bragging. By the end of the first week, the limp had retreated from a statement to a suggestion. By the end of the second, it appeared only when Ranger forgot himself. By the middle of the third, forgetting happened less. The town took notice in the sideways way towns do. Boys stopped and stared and tried to imitate Albert's low whistle when their mothers weren't looking. A woman with flour on her apron tucked a carrot in her pocket on her way to the tavern and pretended it had fallen into Ranger's reach by accident. Men leaned on the fence and pretended to talk about weather. Albert pretended not to notice the noticing. He kept the work steady, hill-walking in the cool hour before heat got its breath. Lateral work to wake the idea that a horse is not just a forward machine, long-lining to link thought to motion without the weight of a man's mistakes on his back. Some mornings, when Ranger forgot to protect himself for 4 strides, 5, 10, and moved how he'd been born to, Albert felt something rise in his throat and have to sit back down again, because a grown man doesn't cry at the edge of a pen unless the world ends or begins. On the 28th day, for 3 heartbeats that belonged entirely to Grace, Ranger lengthened without being asked. The ground came at him and went away like he'd unhooked himself from effort. The sound of his hooves changed, lower, rounder, the sound of a body aligning. Martha lifted her face like you do when a church bell strikes true. "Well," she said simply, and that one word meant she had seen a lot of things. But this still had the right to astonish her. That afternoon, when the sun had become a hard coin nobody could spend, a shadow paused at the gate. A woman in a travel-stained dress and cracked boots stood very still. Her hair was pinned without vanity. Dust had written its name at the hem. She held herself the way people do who have kept walking long after reason told them to stop. Ranger's head came up. He turned, not to the sound, but to the feeling of a sound that hadn't yet arrived. Albert wiped his hands on his trouser leg and turned. The woman's gaze slid past him and landed on the white mark at the stallion's shoulder, as if her heart had handed her a map and said, "There." She didn't come in. She didn't move at all. Only her throat worked, a swallow catching on bone and memory. "Evening," Martha said softly from the doorway, voice shaped to fit the space between brittle and kind. "You look like a person who recognizes something she's not ready to say out loud." The woman's answer was barely a voice. "I do." She stepped to the fence, as if the ground might shift under her if she went too fast. Up close, the travel stain was more story than dirt. The frayed sleeve where a bag had rubbed, the nick at the knuckle from a gate latch that stuck, the edge of a letter peeking from a bodice pocket, creased soft by rereading. Her eyes were the color of a sky that doesn't quite promise rain. Ranger, thunder, took one step toward her and stopped. Not out of fear, but protocol, like he was remembering a lesson taught long before this yard. "This man, this morning, where did you get him?" she asked, and though the words were simple, everything behind them wasn't. "Auction," Albert said. "A month back. Levi Caldwell brought him in. I put $1 on the table, and the town put laughter in the air." Her breath hitched at Levi's name. "Storm night," she said, almost to herself. 2 years ago, our fences went down, and with them went everything we thought a fence could keep. "What do you call him?" Martha asked, quiet as tea steeping. "Thunder," the woman said, and the name fell into the yard like a stone returning to a river it had once lived in. Albert's mouth opened, then closed. "I've been calling him Ranger," he said, and there was apology but no shame in it. "I know that mark," she continued, eyes on the white splash at the shoulder. "My father used to say it looked like a map of the county upside down. And there's a crescent scar on the right fore from when he stepped on broken glass as a yearling. He will, turn his head to a 2-note whistle, low, low." Albert stepped back from the rope, because truth doesn't like a crowded room. "Show me," he said. She set her fingers to her lips and sent 2 soft notes across the small square of world. "Not a trick. not a magic, something learned through bread crusts and patient afternoons, and a man who taught both horse and daughter the same language on different days. Thunder turned his head. His ears carved the air. He nickered, small, private, like a memory answering its name. Then he reached, not with his feet, those stayed proper, but with the space behind his eye. Martha put her hand on the fence to keep it from being the only thing holding her up. Livy, who had wandered back on a conscience that hadn't quite forgiven him, whispered, "God help me." Albert knelt because kneeling made it easier to be wrong without losing your dignity. He lifted the right fore. The scar was there, an old wound pressed into new horn, healed but not erased. He let the hoof down gentle, as if gratitude had weight. "My father bred him," the woman said, voice steadier now that the worst of the finding was done. "Said he had wind inside him that didn't belong to any one man. I've been looking since the night he vanished. I went place to place, asked, and was told to stop asking. I didn't." She pulled the letter from her bodice and smoothed it with quick thumbs. It was a breeding log, names and dates in a neat hand that had learned to be exact because animals can't obey your feelings. A faded photograph accompanied it, a captured moment of a bay stallion mid-stride, legs tucked like the lifted corners of a letter, eyes straight at the horizon. "Elizabeth Whitmore," she said finally. Like the formality of it would make everything less likely to blow away. "My father was Samuel Whitmore. Thunder was stolen in the storm. I believe this is my horse." David materialized at the edge of the knot of people because drama loves a witness. "Well," he said with relish, "if that's true, Albert, you've poured a month of feed into another person's property. That ledger of yours is about to burst into flame." Martha didn't turn. "Find a church, David," she advised. "Sit in the back and practice the art of silence." Albert rose. He looked at Thunder, Ranger, then at Elizabeth. He was a man who had counted losses until the counting wore grooves in him. And here was a ledger that wanted a different kind of entry. "I won't pretend I'm not attached," he said, "because lies taste worse when the air is this clean. I won't pretend I didn't start living a little better these last weeks because I had something to get out of bed for that didn't ask me to be anything but steady." Elizabeth's eyes softened. "I can see what your steadiness did," she said, and the words swept a kind of benediction over the pen. "But he's yours," Albert continued, "by law and by memory. The hoof says so. The whistle says so. I won't hold what doesn't belong to me." He glanced at Levi. "And I'll put right what ignorance did wrong. You'll be repaid for the sale you made in good faith on bad information." Levi shook his head, eyes wet and angry at the same time. "I'll take what the judge says I deserve and nothing you can't spare," he managed. "I'm tired of my hunger costing other men their honor." Elizabeth slid a hand along Thunder's neck, palm finding the place under the mane where the skin is thinner and kindness arrives quicker. The stallion leaned just enough. "I didn't come to strip you bare," she said. "I came to ask the world to give back what it took. But I can see he isn't the only thing the world handed you in return for your care. If you will allow it, I'd like to finish what you started. He isn't entirely mended. My father taught me cues and patience. You've taught him to trust himself again. Between us, we can make him whole." She hesitated, pride and problem-solving squaring their shoulders at each other. "And I'll share the costs. I've saved some money. Not much, but honest." Albert looked at Thunder, at the clean line of shoulder to knee, at the place where the old shoe had bitten and the new had set things right. He looked at Elizabeth, at the way grief had honed her but not hollowed her. He looked at Martha, who looked back with that expression women keep for men about to do the right thing even though it hurts. "All right," he said softly. "We'll do it together. We'll keep the work quiet and the days steady. And when he's himself, you'll lead him home." David made a noise that might have been a scoff if it hadn't been so small. "Charity and sentiment," he muttered. "You'll be broke by fall." Martha finally turned, ledger clasped like scripture. "I keep accounts for a living," she said, "and I have never once balanced a book that forgot to tally decency. It pays, David, not always in the coins you count, but it pays. The farrier's lantern would come again, and with it the second shoe. The creek would run, The poles would sit in the dirt like low challenges met each day. And now there would be a woman at the fence each morning, a two-note whistle tucked in her pocket, and a stallion who answered to two names, because sometimes we are more than one thing, and all of it is true. As the sun slid toward the far line of hills and turned the world the color of remembering, Elizabeth stood with her hand on Thunder's shoulder and watched Albert reset the poles by a thumb's breadth. It was a small adjustment, almost nothing. The kind that keeps a living thing moving from better to best without noticing the distance traveled until you look back and can't see where you started. "Tomorrow," Albert said, not to anyone in particular, or maybe to all of them at once. "We'll begin again." The tavern's back rooms smelled of lamp oil, dust, and yesterday's coffee, the scent of truth about to be spoken. A single lantern swung overhead, its glow catching the edges of three faces drawn into quiet decision: Albert, Elizabeth, and Martha. The wooden table between them was layered with papers, breeding logs, scribbled notes, invoices, and a faded photograph of a bay stallion in mid-stride. Thunder's outline, powerful even in stillness, seemed to lean toward them from another time. Albert sat with his elbows braced on the table, his hat in his lap, jaw set as if to hold back the ache that had been waiting to speak. Elizabeth stood beside him, the lantern light painting copper in her hair, her hands trembling only when she stopped holding them together. "So," Martha said, the words falling like a gavel, "it's decided. The papers line up, the scar matches, and that whistle trick, well, you can't fake love that old." Elizabeth nodded once. "He's my father's horse," she said softly, "but I'd never take him from a man who's given him back his legs." Albert's eyes lifted, slow and measured. "And yet," he said, "he's yours. I've had enough taken from me to know the weight of losing what's rightfully yours. I won't add to that burden, but it isn't only about ownership," Elizabeth countered. "He's not whole yet. He needs care, patience. You've given him both. If we rush him home to my ranch before he's strong enough, I'll lose him twice." Martha leaned back, her ledger balanced on one knee. "Then the simple answer is you don't rush," she said. "You finish the healing here. Shared care, shared cost. Albert's hand and your knowledge. Seems Thunder gets the best of both worlds." Albert rubbed a thumb along the table's edge, staring at the grain as if the right path might be written there. "I'll reimburse Levi for what I paid," he said finally. "He sold in ignorance. He shouldn't carry guilt that doesn't belong to him. As for Thunder, we'll finish his conditioning together. You'll have your horse when he's whole enough to earn that name again." Elizabeth exhaled, not relief exactly, but the sound of balance finding itself. "That's fair," she said. "And when he's strong, I'll see that your name is cleared at the auction block. No one will call you a fool again." Martha's mouth curved faintly. "Darling, fools and prophets are only separated by the outcome. Let the horse make the verdict." The door creaked. David Whitmore filled the frame, hat cocked, smirk sharp. "Am I interrupting a sermon or a charity meeting?" he asked, eyes sweeping the papers. "You mean to tell me you're about to bankroll another person's horse, Albert? You planning to put Saint in front of your name now?" Albert didn't flinch. "I'm planning to sleep at night." David's laughter came brittle and hollow. "You'll never rebuild your ranch like this. Business doesn't bend for kindness." "No," Albert said quietly, "but men do, or they break." The silence that followed made David's smirk wilt. He muttered something about wasted sentiment and stepped back into the glare of the main room where the piano had resumed its off-key patience. Martha closed her ledger with a sharp clap. "Well," she said, "that's that. We'll keep him fed and shoed. Elizabeth, you'll help with feed and training. Albert, you'll handle the work. And when it's done, you both walk out of this with more than you came in with." Elizabeth smiled, small but true. "Agreed," Albert nodded. "Agreed." The lantern flame flickered, caught a draft and flared before steadying again, as if sealing the pact. Outside, Thunder shifted in the pen, restless but sound. For the first time in years, the night around them didn't feel like something closing in. It felt like something waiting to begin. Spring arrived quiet and steady, the kind of season that healed without boasting. The thaw left the earth soft and forgiving beneath hooves, and the air carried the scent of wet soil and possibility. Each morning, Albert and Elizabeth worked side by side in the pen, their shadows long and parallel in the dawn. They divided the day like a prayer, mornings for groundwork, evenings for trust. Elizabeth brought her father's old cues, the low whistle for calm, the slight pressure of fingers against the rein to signal turn. Albert brought his methodical precision, the science of muscle recovery and rhythm. Together, they found a language that wasn't hers or his, but theirs, built from patience, grit, and the sound of hooves learning to sing again. Thunder's gait grew smoother by the week. The limp, once sharp as a knife, dulled into memory. His eyes, once wary, held a quiet pride. He began to reach for the halter in the morning, not shy away from it. When Albert led him to the creek, he went willingly, the water rising past his knees without a flinch. "His back's filling out," Albert said one morning, running his hand over the stallion's ribline. "He's building muscle where it used to fade. We'll test a light trot next week." Elizabeth smiled, wiping her hands on her skirt. "My father always said horses heal when they start believing they can run again." "You've given him that," Albert shook his head. He gave it to himself. "I just made room for it." Martha appeared at the fence, carrying 2 mugs and a disapproving look softened by affection. "You two talk like poets," she said. "Poets don't pay for oats. Keep him moving." The weeks passed with a rhythm as natural as breathing. When Thunder stumbled, they steadied him. When he soared, they didn't try to hold him down. Sometimes Elizabeth caught Albert watching her instead of the horse, and neither spoke of it. It was easier to let the work be the conversation. The evenings grew longer. The sunsets stretched in honeyed streaks. They worked until the light was nearly gone, then sat on overturned barrels, watching Thunder graze. The silence between them was comfortable, full of things that didn't need saying. "He listens to you," Albert said one night. Elizabeth glanced at him, then at the horse. "He listens to us. I think he knows we both had something to lose." Albert nodded slowly. "And something to prove." They didn't notice Martha watching from the doorway, arms folded, the faintest smile touching her face. She had seen the same story written 100 ways across the frontier, 2 lonely souls rebuilding themselves in the reflection of something worth saving. As the weeks turned into months, the partnership deepened. Elizabeth took over long-lining practice, guiding Thunder through wide, smooth circles that taught balance and grace. Albert built ground poles higher, forcing Thunder to lift, to stretch, to remember speed without pain. They measured progress in moments. A clean figure 8, a calm trailer load, a balanced canter that whispered of the champion beneath the scar. Thunder began to run again, not wildly, but purposefully. His stride opened like a book returning to the first good page. The townsfolk gathered at the fence more often, whispering in disbelief. The cripple had become the pride of the county yard. One evening, as twilight bled across the horizon, Elizabeth turned to Albert and said quietly, "When he's ready, I'll take him home. But I don't want to undo what you've built here." Albert looked at her for a long moment. "Maybe what we're building isn't meant to be undone," he said. The air between them changed, not tense, not tender, but aware. Thunder snorted and pawed at the dirt, impatient for something neither of them could yet name. The next morning, Albert found a note from Martha tucked into his feed ledger. "You've built more than muscle here. Don't be afraid of the kind of healing you can't weigh." He folded the paper and kept it in his pocket. By the end of the 6th week, Thunder's transformation was complete. His coat gleamed like burnished copper, his stride clean, his eyes alive with the kind of confidence only survival can give. Elizabeth and Albert stood shoulder to shoulder, watching him gallop free across the field beyond the tavern. The sound of his hooves was no longer the beat of effort. It was music. "That's not just recovery," Elizabeth whispered. "That's rebirth," Albert nodded. "He's ready," and he was, though neither said aloud that readiness came with consequence. For soon, Thunder would run again under his rightful name, and Albert would have to face the hardest truth of all, that some things you heal only to give away. Still, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and the first stars winked alive, he felt something settle in him, not loss, but peace. Tomorrow they would test Thunder's full stride. And with that run, everything, the past, the pride, the pain, would change shape once more. The weeks that followed were golden and busy, the kind of days that smelled like redemption. The tavern yard had turned from a quiet rehabilitation pen into a crossroads of curiosity. Men leaning on fence rails whispered about what they'd seen, the crippled bay, now running near perfect circles under two watchful eyes. The rumor spread like prairie fire. The fastest horse in 3 counties had come back from the dead. Albert didn't care for gossip, but gossip had a way of finding him anyway. It arrived in the form of wagers, of sidelong glances, of questions disguised as compliments. "Heard your charity case might outrun David Whitmore's grey," someone muttered one morning at the feed store. Albert didn't answer, but when he left he carried himself a little straighter. He knew better than to believe the town's fickle affection. They cheered miracles they didn't have to make. Elizabeth felt the tide shift too. Each time she walked Thunder through the market road, people stopped and stared, some offering sympathy, others opportunity. One rancher offered to buy Thunder outright, cash up front, debts erased. She refused politely the first time. The second offer came from her cousin, David Whitmore himself. He cornered her behind the tavern as Thunder cooled off after a long training session. "You could clear your father's debts by morning," he said, flashing the same charming smirk that had always hidden his cruelty. "Sell him to me. You can't hold on to that ranch alone, Lizzie." Elizabeth's chin lifted. "I won't sell what doesn't have a price." David laughed, low and dangerous. "Everything has a price, even principles, especially yours." Albert appeared from the barn, sweat streaking his shirt, voice steady as a gun barrel. "You might want to take that tone somewhere else, David. The lady's already spoken." David turned, smile sharpening. "Careful, Thorne. You've got a bad habit of rescuing things that don't belong to you. A horse, a woman's pride, even your own dignity." Albert didn't move, but the quiet around him turned solid. "You're right," he said softly. "But I'm learning how to keep what's worth keeping." David's smirk faltered. He spat into the dirt and walked off, boots grinding his retreat into the ground. That night, Martha wiped the counter clean while the lamps burned low. "You both need to be careful," she said, voice gentler than usual. "Whitmore's pride is a snake that doesn't die easy, and rumor's a blade that cuts both ways. Folks are whispering about you two." Elizabeth blinked. "What sort of whispering?" "The kind that says a man and woman don't spend that many hours together mending what's broken without mending each other too." Martha sighed. "It's small-town math, and it always adds to the same total." Albert looked up from his cup. "Let them talk," he said. "The horse doesn't care who believes what." "Maybe," Martha replied, "but people's belief can weigh more than truth when the right eyes are watching." 2 days later, Levi Caldwell came running up the lane, his breath carrying urgency. "Albert," he called. "Saw a man at the trading post this morning, matched the drifter's description from that storm night. Same hat, same scar over the brow. Said he was heading south to Carson Creek. He's been peddling horses with bad papers." Albert's gut tightened. "You sure?" "Sure as rain." Levi hesitated. "You thinking of going after him?" "Not alone," Albert said, already reaching for his coat. "But we'll need proof before we call in the marshal." Elizabeth's eyes flashed determination. "Then we'll find it." Martha appeared in the doorway, blocking the path. "If you two go chasing ghosts, at least take my cousin's wagon. You catch that thief, you bring back a statement signed and sealed. The law won't lift a finger without it." So they rode, Albert, Elizabeth, and Levi, tracking the drifter's trail through the scrublands beyond town. Each mile carried them deeper into the borderlands of justice and survival. They found him 2 days later at a broken corral near the ridge, selling a paint mare with the same forged brand that had once disguised Thunder. The confrontation was brief and bitter. The drifter recognized Levi and tried to run, but age and guilt slowed him. Albert pinned him against the rail, his voice low and precise. You sold a stolen horse to an honest man and left 2 others to fight for what was right. You'll sign your name to the truth, tonight." The drifter hesitated until Elizabeth stepped forward, eyes fierce. "You stole my father's legacy," she said. "The least you can do is give back the truth." Something in her steadiness broke him. His hand shook as he scrawled a confession across Martha's parchment. Thunder Whitmore. Stolen 2 years prior by Samuel Blake. Sold under false pretense to Levi Caldwell. Albert sealed the paper in his jacket, feeling justice hum like a live wire against his chest. When they rode back to town, dawn was already painting the horizon. None of them spoke. Thunder would have his freedom, and with it, so would Albert. Back at the tavern, Martha took the statement and tucked it into her ledger. "You've done what lawmen should have done years ago," she said. "Now all that's left is showing the town what truth can do when it runs free." By week's end, the whispers had changed tune. The talk wasn't about a lame horse anymore, but about a race, not for money, but for redemption. Someone proposed it first as a jest. Let's see if the cripple can still fly, but the idea caught like dry tinder. The townsfolk wanted proof. They wanted spectacle. And maybe, secretly, they wanted to believe that broken things could be made whole again. Albert tried to refuse. "He's not a trick for amusement," he said. "He's earned his rest." But Elizabeth's gaze was steady. "This isn't a circus. It's testimony. Let them see what care can do." Albert hesitated, then nodded. "Then we'll do it our way. No saddle, no bridle. Just trust." Martha crossed her arms. "Then it better be the kind of trust that won't break when the world's watching." The morning of the race arrived wrapped in silence and gold light. The oval field outside town had been cleared and lined with rope. The townsfolk gathered along the ridge, murmuring with the electricity of something about to matter. Children climbed fence rails. Even David Whitmore was there, arms crossed, eyes cold but uncertain. Albert stood beside Thunder, brushing the stallion's gleaming coat one last time. Elizabeth checked the rope halter, fingers steady, though her heart raced beneath her ribs. Martha kept time on a silver pocket watch, her lips pressed tight. Thunder tossed his head, sensing the tension like static. "Easy, boy," Albert murmured. "This isn't for them. It's for us." Elizabeth stepped closer, voice low. "Let him remember what freedom feels like." When Albert mounted bareback, the crowd hushed. The old rivalry, the debts, the laughter from that dusty auction yard, all of it seemed to hang in the air, waiting for a verdict. He guided Thunder to the starting line. The stallion stood quivering, muscles rippling under the morning sun. Martha raised her hand. "Whenever you're ready," she said. Albert met Elizabeth's eyes. "Now." The world exhaled. Thunder leapt forward, hooves striking the earth in a rhythm too perfect to be born of pain. Dust rose behind them like smoke, curling and golden. Albert leaned low over the withers, every muscle remembering what it meant to trust. The wind tore at his shirt, filled his lungs, erased the weight of years. Elizabeth timed the splits on Martha's watch, her voice trembling with awe. "Faster than before," she whispered. Faster than ever. The crowd erupted, not laughter this time, but wonder. Men who'd mocked now cheered. Women who'd doubted wiped tears. Even David lowered his gaze, jaw tight, humbled by the simple truth of effort redeemed. Albert guided Thunder through the final stretch with nothing but breath and belief. The horse moved like a hymn, powerful, certain, healed. When they crossed the invisible finish line, silence held for one stunned heartbeat before the roar came. Elizabeth ran forward as Albert slid from Thunder's back, both of them laughing and breathless. "He's perfect," she said, tears streaking the dust on her cheeks. "You made him perfect." Albert shook his head, still catching breath. "No, we just reminded him who he was." Thunder pranced beside them, tail lifted, every step alive with pride. The town would remember this day, not as a race, but as resurrection. Martha approached, eyes wet but smiling. "Well," she said, closing her watch, "I reckon the world can believe in miracles again." Albert looked at Elizabeth, the crowd still cheering around them. "So what now?" he asked softly. Elizabeth's answer came without hesitation. "Now," she said, "we build something that lasts." And as Thunder nuzzled their joined hands, it was clear The story of redemption was no longer just his. It belonged to them all. The morning after the race, the air felt lighter, as if the valley itself had been holding its breath through all those months of recovery and finally let it go. The town buzzed with talk of Thunder, of Albert and Elizabeth, of what they had done together. Martha's Tavern, once the place where debts were whispered and jokes cut deep, now thrummed with gratitude and the smell of fresh bread instead of bitterness. At a corner table beneath the window, Albert and Elizabeth sat surrounded by papers, ink, and Martha's sharp-eyed supervision. The sunlight coming through the glass fell across their hands, catching on the wet ink of new beginnings. "These are the contracts," Martha said, adjusting her spectacles. "You two are officially partners now, on paper and, if I'm any judge, in spirit." The document laid out their future clearly. Elizabeth retained ownership of Thunder, but Albert would share in the horses' training, breeding, and the foundation of a new equine rehabilitation program on the Whitmore Ranch. Martha, ever the pragmatic investor, had bought a small stake, fodder supply, boarding rights, and event hosting to keep them solvent and respectable. Albert dipped the pen into the inkwell, hesitating before signing. "Feels strange," he murmured. "To have something start right for once." Elizabeth smiled, her eyes soft. "It's not starting right," she said. "It's starting honest. That's rarer." He nodded, signing his name with steady strokes. The signature looked different than it had years ago, firmer, deliberate. Beside it, Elizabeth's name bloomed like a promise. Martha added hers last. "There," she said, rolling the paper and tying it with a red ribbon. "A contract written in ink, sealed with sweat and witnessed by half the town's gossip. If that doesn't make it official, nothing will." Levi Caldwell entered quietly, hat in hand. "I came to see if the settlement went through," he said. Albert stood, extending a sealed envelope. "Paid in full," he said. "And the judge accepted the drifter's confession this morning. You're cleared of any wrongdoing, Levi. It's done." Levi blinked hard, the weight of 2 years of shame lifting visibly from his shoulders. "You didn't have to—" "Yeah," Albert interrupted. "I did." Levi swallowed thickly. "Then I'll repay it the way I can. Fence posts, lumber, whatever you need. I'm done running from the things that hurt me." David Whitmore arrived soon after, though his swagger was gone. His hat was in his hand too, and that alone was a sort of apology. "You made a fool of me, Thorne," he said quietly. "Turns out I needed it." Albert studied him, then nodded. "We both did." David shifted awkwardly. "I've got freight contacts east of here. Good prices on feed and lumber. I'll send them your way." "Call it Grace," Martha supplied dryly. "It's called Grace, David. Try it on, see how it fits." David gave a half smile. "Maybe I will." The rest of that day was a blur of hammers, saws, and laughter. Men and women from the settlement showed up unasked, bringing tools, nails, and stories. They raised fences, mended the old corral at the Whitmore Ranch, and painted the sign that had weathered and fallen during the storm years ago. Elizabeth found the broken planks in the shed and began sanding the old wood herself. When Albert joined her, she handed him a brush without looking up. "We'll call it the Founder's Drive," she said, "a parade from town to the ranch. Not for show, for closure." Albert smiled. "Closure's just another word for beginnings done right." By sunset, the ranch was alive again, the hum of labor turning into laughter. The community that had once mocked now helped rebuild. And standing in the center of it all was Thunder, gleaming in the dusk, the wind tugging at his mane, like it wanted to remember how freedom felt. Morning came dressed in clarity. A pale gold light spilled over the horizon, setting the fences aglow. The Founder's Drive was ready, a slow procession from town to the newly restored Whitmore Ranch. Families gathered with baskets, flags, and music. Children ran barefoot beside wagons decorated with ribbons. The smell of coffee, dust, and hope mingled in the air. Thunder stood at the head of the line, muscles taut, coat radiant. Elizabeth held the lead, Albert at her shoulder. Martha rode in a wagon behind them, ledger in her lap and pride in her eyes. "Quite the crowd for a pair of quiet folk," she teased. Albert chuckled. "I'd call it repayment for every laugh they had at that auction." Elizabeth smiled, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Let them laugh," she said. "They're part of the story now." As they moved through the town, people cheered, not for victory, but for vindication. Shopkeepers leaned out of windows. Children threw wildflowers into the road. Even David tipped his hat when they passed the post office, the smallest gesture of respect that meant more than apology. The journey to the ranch was slow and deliberate, the sound of hooves rhythmic and sure. At the gates of the Whitmore property, newly restored, sign rehung, the crowd gathered around. Elizabeth stopped and turned to face them all. "My father built this ranch with faith," she said, her voice steady and strong. "And when he lost it, I thought the world had taken everything. But it hadn't. It was only waiting to see if I'd remember what it meant to rebuild." She turned to Albert. "And I couldn't have done it without a man who saw value in what others called worthless." Albert's jaw tightened. Emotion held back with the same restraint he'd lived his life by. "Wasn't worthlessness," he said. "Just waiting for the right hands." Thunder snorted softly as if in agreement. Elizabeth laughed through her tears. Martha dismounted and took the new sign from the back of the wagon. Together, they hung it above the gate. "Whitmore Thorne Ranch, where the broken are made whole." The crowd erupted in applause. Levi brought out stew and coffee, and soon the yard was full of warmth and noise. David poured cider for the workers. The drifter's confession, now sealed and filed, had already reached the circuit judge. The law had caught up with what the heart already knew. As evening descended, the sky blazed orange and violet. Thunder stood in his new stall, the door open so he could watch the light fade. Elizabeth brushed his neck while Albert leaned against the post beside her. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked quietly. Albert smiled faintly. "Every day. But for the first time, it doesn't scare me." She looked at him, really looked, and saw a man no longer haunted by failure, but defined by grace. "You could stay, you know," she said. "The ranch has room for more than horses." He met her gaze. "You sure about that?" "I am," she said simply. Martha appeared in the doorway, pretending not to hear but smiling all the same. "You two planning futures, or should I bring supper before it goes cold?" Albert laughed. "Maybe both." The stars began to prick through the indigo sky. The townsfolk lingered, unwilling to leave the warmth of a night that felt like promise. Thunder lowered his head, exhaling a sound that was almost human in its peace. Albert watched him, then looked back at the horizon where the last light faded behind the hills. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think saving something broken meant fixing it. Turns out it just means staying long enough for it to remember how to heal itself." Elizabeth's hand found his. "Then stay," she whispered. And as thunder nickered softly in the stable, the wind moved across the field, carrying with it the sound of laughter, hooves, and rebirth. The frontier had tested them all, but in the end, it had given them something better than survival. It had given them belonging. And under the wide, forgiving sky, Albert Thorne finally understood that redemption doesn't come to the righteous. It comes to those who see the broken and choose to stay anyway. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.